We're continuing our journey through the book of Acts this summer, and today we come to one of the two pivotal moments in the book of Acts. This is one of those dividing lines, the conversion of Saul. Now, Saul is an interesting fellow. You say, who is Saul? Well, Saul is a person that we were introduced to not too long ago when we were talking about the persecution that the church was facing. We were introduced to Saul. And he was giving approval to the stoning of Stephen, the first person to be killed for his faith since Jesus. And great persecution caused the church to spread out geographically all around the area. And then we heard last week about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. So the church was spreading and sharing the good news with different kinds of people. Saul, however, would have none of it. Now, he would have considered himself a good man. He grew up in the faith. He loved God. He loved the Scriptures. He knew the Scriptures very well. He grew up a Jew. And so he had one of the finest educations. He had a great teacher, and he knew the faith very well. Saul was named after the first king of Israel. And so being named after a king of Israel means your parents probably have some pretty high expectations of you. Now, if you read about Saul the king, you know that he started out very promising. He was a very promising king. He did some good things while he was king, but he went downhill as he became paranoid of David. But nonetheless, Saul was known by some to be a great king. And so by being named after him, you know your parents have some high expectations. But he lived up to them. I mean, like I said, he went to the finest schools, he learned, he grew, he excelled as a Pharisee, and he was very passionate about what he believed in. And in fact, it's because of his view of the Scriptures, because of all that he knew of the Scriptures, that he knew that this cult, this group within the Jewish faith who believed that this man named Jesus had risen from the dead, had to be put to a stop. It just was not in line and in step with how he understood the Scriptures. There were no Scriptures that would lead him to Jesus yet. But at this point in his life, he did not see anywhere in the Scriptures that would lead him to Jesus. In fact, that's the whole thing we're talking about this summer, is about how the first followers of Jesus had to rethink their faith, rethink what they thought about God and what they thought about the Scriptures in light of the surprising that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead on the third day. None of that fit into their paradigm of how they thought things were supposed to work. And so Saul just knew that this movement had to be stamped out. And so that's why he oversaw the stoning of Stephen. That's why he would go routinely to different places and imprison people. And so in our story, he's on his way to Damascus to do the same thing, to imprison some followers of the way. That's what they were referred to as, followers of the way. The term Christian would gain steam later, but right now they were considered followers of the way. They were still Jewish. There was no such thing as a separate Christianity faith until well late into the first century, second century. So everybody's Jewish still, but he was going to put a stop to this. And so on his way to Damascus, you know the story probably pretty well. He has this blinding light, and he's knocked to the ground by this blinding light. And so there's a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And so he recognizes that this is a supernatural event, and so he says, "Who's speaking to me?" You know, is it an angel? Is it a messenger? I mean, who is it? And his mind, no doubt, must have been blown when the voice said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." And right then you start to reevaluate everything. So he is blinded by this light. Let me tell you, if you ever drive going west on a sunny evening, you know what a blinding light is like, right? You just hate it when the sun gets down lower than the visor, and you know you're in for it for a while until it gets down to the horizon. It's going to be hard to drive. You can't see anything else. That's why we call it blinding. And Saul was literally blinded from this light. He couldn't see anything. And so he was told by Jesus to go into Damascus and to wait. And so he does that, because what else are you going to do after you've heard this voice and you're blinded? And so his people who were with him, they help him get to town, since he can't see anything. And it says he spent time waiting in prayer, and he fasted. He didn't eat or drink anything. So this is a time of deep reflection. Meanwhile, God is working in other people's lives. So let's not, I don't want you to be fooled into thinking God only works with one person at a time. God is speaking to another person in Damascus named Ananias. Now, this is not to be confused with the Ananias who lied about the selling of their property. You remember Ananias and Sapphira from last month, if you were here that Sunday. This is not that person. This is a different Ananias. And Ananias has a vision of God. He feels called by God to go to the place where Saul is and to pray for him. God says, I want you to pray that he might restore his sight, for I have told him that you are coming. No pressure there. I told him you're coming, so please come. And Ananias hesitates. This is not a surprise. Ananias is thinking, Saul? Saul is the one breathing out murderous threats to us. I can't do anything with Saul. I can't convert him. If I go to him and restore his sight or pray for him, I'm going to end up in prison. I'm not going to convince this guy that Christ should be followed, that Jesus is the Christ. I'm not going to convince him of that. But nonetheless, he goes. He follows and he goes. And when he gets to the house, he prays for Saul and he restores his sight. And then the rest just happens automatically because Saul has been prepared. He's been spending these 3 days in deep reflection, probably rethinking all of his assumptions about life. All of a sudden, when you realize that the one that you've been trying to stamp out is the true one, that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, then that's going to lead you to question everything. It's like a house of cards type thing. You start questioning that one thing. He was devoting his life to putting an end to this, and now, after he doubted that causes him to doubt and rethink how he views his scriptures, how he views his education, how he views how he grew up, and everything that he's learned, and everything that he thought that he knew about God and how God worked. And so it's that kind of life reorienting process that he is facing. And so when Ananias comes 3 days later and restores his sight, he's ready. He's ready, And so he converts, he becomes a follower of the way, and then after a while he starts preaching Jesus in the synagogues. And of course people are like, whoa, who is this guy? We know who he is. But no, he continued. He actually had to have some people advocate for him to say, no, he's not trying to trick us. He's really changed. So this is one of the most dramatic conversion stories in the Bible. This is about as dramatic as it gets. Every now and then we hear stories like that, testimonies that are just really encouraging, stories about people who... I've heard stories about people who've had visions of God. I've heard stories of people who had these seemingly supernatural events happen to them, and they are transformed. But for every one person who has a dramatic story like that, there's 2 or 3 who have a story where they just encounter God in nature, or they feel convicted by the Holy Spirit. I don't want you to feel discouraged. Sometimes we feel convicted and we're like, well, why don't I have a story like that? Why don't I have an experience like that? Maybe I haven't experienced God. Maybe I'm not what I think I am. And I would just like to say that salvation is not a one-size-fits-all thing. Everybody's experience is not going to be the same. Saul had a situation where he was a jerk before, right? I mean, he probably didn't view himself that way. He probably thought he was really faithful to God, but he was kind of a jerk. And then he completely turned his life around, and he's like this super apostle, And we hear stories about that too, about people who before they knew Christ, they were just doing all these things, and then afterwards they turn their life completely around. But guess what? Maybe you have a story where you were a pretty decent person before you knew Christ, and you're a pretty decent person after you knew Christ. There's not like a light and day difference between the two. You might have a story that's not really that spectacular. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, you can't get much more boring than that for a conversion story. He goes to a Bible study that he doesn't even want to go to, and then somebody's reading the preface to the Romans. How boring can you get? And then it's during that, when the teacher's reading something out of some sermon notes or Bible notes, that he says, I felt my heart strangely warmed, and I believe that Christ did die for me. And then his life was transformed. I mean, he did have a dramatic change, obviously, in his life, but the conversion story was kind of boring. He just went to a Bible study. God can reach you anywhere, in any way. And just because your story isn't as dramatic or as amazing as some stories, it doesn't make it any less authentic. It doesn't make it any less real. God works in our lives in different ways. And there's, like I said, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to salvation. I remember when shortly after undergraduate school, I became a local licensed pastor at some churches in Missouri. And I remember a person had passed away, and I went to the home and visited with the family to get ready for the funeral. And this person had been active in the church for years and years, and they had just been very active in the church. And I remember one of the family members was really kind of excited to tell me, well, she said, did they tell you how long he's been a Christian? Did they tell you how long he's been a Christian? No. Nobody had told me, and so she was really kind of excited to tell me that he hadn't been a Christian that long because she had recently led him in the sinner's prayer. And therefore, the idea, the implication being he would have gone to hell before that if she had not led him in that sinner's prayer. And I was pretty young in my faith, but even then I thought something didn't seem quite right about that. But the thing is, you will not find a one-size-fits-all approach to salvation. There's not a single magic prayer that no matter what happens in a person's life, if they did not say that prayer, they're out of God's good grace. Or that if they did say a prayer, there's not a magical prayer, there isn't a magical prayer in the world you can say that can just give you a get-out-of-jail-free card no matter what. And so, when we look at the New Testament, you will find that neither Jesus nor the disciples nor any of the other followers of Christ ever led somebody in what's called a sinner's prayer. Now, you might be able to string some verses together. Sometimes we do the Romans road. We can take a verse from this chapter of Romans, that chapter of Romans, that chapter of Romans, and splice them all together and say, here's a sinner's prayer. That's okay. That's a decent prayer to pray if you're ready to dedicate your life to Christ. That's a good way to verbalize and to say what it is that you're committing your life to. In case you don't know, the sinner's prayer is very basically when you say, God, I'm sorry, I realize that I have sinned. Please forgive me. Come into my life. I want to live for you. That's it in a nutshell. And so it's very biblical in a way, and it's very truthful, and it's a good prayer to pray. But there's nothing magical about it that it's like the gate that unless you say that prayer, you're out. And so I tend to say from that experience in Missouri and just observing in life, we can see that people come to God in many different ways. There's not necessarily a prayer to say. There's not necessarily an experience to have. But God works in our hearts in different ways. So just be aware of that if you hear a story like Saul's or a story like somebody else that they've shared. God speaks to us in so many different ways. That's number one. Number two, as we look at Saul, he changed his name to Paul. He goes throughout the known world spreading the gospel to the non-Jewish population. That will turn out to be the greatest controversy and division that the church will face in the first century will be about that issue. But as he shares and he writes letters to these churches, these letters become part of the New Testament. You know, Paul wrote a good portion of the New Testament. In fact, Paul is said to have been the most influential person in the Christian world in history besides Jesus. That's a pretty good resume right there. And so thank goodness Ananias did not write him off as hopeless. Right? I mean, really, what if Ananias had said no? God probably would have gone to someone else. I mean, God has a plan B. He has to always have a plan B. But thank goodness Ananias was willing to give Saul a chance. You know, I'm sure that we all have people in our lives that we know that we kind of view that way. You know, maybe we write them off. We say, there's nothing we can do. You know, we can't convince this person. Maybe it's somebody who doesn't believe in God, or maybe they think God could exist, I don't know, but I want nothing to do with church because church is full of hypocrites and scandals and bad things and whatnot. And they're just convinced in their mind that and you're thinking, I can't convince them otherwise. Or maybe it's not somebody who doesn't believe in God. Maybe they do believe in God. Maybe they profess Jesus Christ, but like the atheist, they think they know everything. And they think that they know everything about God, therefore you're not going to convince them. You might think you're not going to convince them God can work in a new way any more than anyone was going to convince Saul that God could work in a new way. Saul thought he knew everything about God. And so when you think you know everything about God, it really makes it like for God to surprise you. And so, thank goodness Ananias didn't think that, right? So what do we do with the people in our lives who, wherever they're at, whether they believe in God or not, whether they're involved in church or not, but you feel like you just can't get through to them, what do? Well, you do what Ananias did. You see, Ananias was not called to convert Saul. He wasn't told to do that. He wasn't called to convince him of the truth of Christianity. He wasn't called to make him become a follower of the way. All he did was he came and he prayed for Saul. That's all he did. He said, God said, go over there and pray for him that he may restore his sight. Not a big deal. Now, for us, that's a big deal. If you got called by God and you said you're going to go pray for someone to restore their sight, you'd be like, whoa, that's a big deal. But back then, that stuff happened quite often. But basically, he's being called to go over and pray for Saul. And then God's taking care of the rest because God's already been working on Saul, preparing him. Maybe Jesus knew that knocking him to the ground in a blinding light was the only way to get through to him. I don't know. But he prepared him ahead of time. So when Ananias came and prayed for him, that was all he had to do. That's all that was needed. He was ready at that point to commit his life to Christ. And so if you have somebody in your mind that you think, I don't know how to reach them, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to convince them, maybe if we follow the example of Ananias, we listen for the Spirit of God, and then we find opportunities to love them and care for them and serve them. So maybe it's praying for them, maybe it's serving them a meal, maybe it's some other way to show them that you care. And I know that sounds like a cop-out. You know, it sounds like, well, that's not evangelism, you know, that's not. But for some people, you're not going to just completely make them rethink their life based on a good argument or a Facebook meme. You know, you're not going to make them rethink their life. We tend to be confirmed in whatever we know. I always like it. Sometimes there's like, I've seen things on Facebook before, like, this is satirical, but it would say, news reports confirm. The Mueller report, the result of the Mueller report is whatever you already believed. If you, if you believe that Trump conspired with the Russians, the Mueller report confirms that. If you believe that he didn't, the Mueller report confirms that. So often we confirm what we already believe, and we frame things in a way that makes sense for what we already know. So it really is an uphill battle to convince somebody that the way they are thinking might be wrong or ill-informed. So your job isn't always to do that. Your job is not always to convince people. That's the Holy Spirit's job. Your job is to do what God has called you to do. And maybe for some people that's actually sharing with them, maybe some of that verbal communication. But for some people it might be laying the seed by serving a meal, praying for them, sending them something, whatever you can do. And you can pray that maybe they would be open to the Spirit of God in their lives. And maybe God would prepare them. That's what Ananias did. He prayed for Saul. And God had already been in work in the process. So I'd like to encourage you to not write anyone off as hopeless, but to ask God, what can I do to be a help, to be a part of the process whereby they may experience the love of God? How can I be an Ananias for someone else? Amen.